and welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Samuel Bassani, and if you're not familiar with him, he is an audio engineer based out of São Paulo, Brazil. He has worked with a bunch of different producers, people like Drew Fulk, Kevin Thrasher, Nick Radovanovic, who I recently had on the podcast. And he's also worked with artists like Alpha Wolf, Hands Like Houses, the Amity Affliction, and a bunch more. And these days, Samuel does a lot of editing work. You know, some people try to be producers or mixers. Samuel's gone a little bit of a different direction, and he focuses a lot more these days on being an editor and working with other producers. And editing is something that I think is a major part of the process when it comes to production. But yet, so many people gloss over it. So many people don't want to do it because it's time consuming, or maybe they think, well, my tracks are good enough, so I don't really need to edit them. Or maybe there's an ego thing where people feel ashamed to edit their tracks, thinking that, you know, it makes them seem like a bad musician or something like that, which isn't the case at all. But editing can really make or break a mix. It can really set your mix up to get better results when you take the time to edit your tracks for timing, edit them for tuning, and do some of the other little tricks that Samuel talks about in this episode here. And that's why I wanted to bring him on here. I wanted to do a deep dive into what really goes into editing and what details should you be paying attention to. And he goes into a lot of great detail as far as what steps he takes along the way, what tools he's using, how to do it, as well as some of the cool tricks that you might not have even thought about that you can take care of in the recording stage that make editing significantly easier, or things you can do in editing that then make the mixing process easier as well. So I think there's so much good stuff in this episode. You're really going to find this one helpful. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Samuel Bassani, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. What's going on, dude?
Dude, I'm great. I'm absolutely stoked to be here. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, and some of the projects that you maybe worked on, can you give us that background on ultimately how you got into music and music production and all the cool stuff you're working on?
Yeah, of course. So I started as a drummer. I played drums like since I was, 3 or 4. And everything started when I was finishing college, and I wanted to do something with drums. Like, the only thing that I knew is that I needed to do something in music, and I just didn't know why. Like, at the time, I wanted to be a professional drummer and tour with artists and that kind of thing. But very fast, I realized that I hate traveling. So like touring wasn't gonna be a really good option for me. So at the same time I got in the audio college that we have here in Brazil, and there I found out about this whole world, and I started to think that a good option for me would be to become a session drummer and track drums for other people, have my own place that I could record in and like that kind of stuff. However, things changed when I joined URM. I started getting some editing work from the community there and like MIDI drums, because since I'm a drummer, MIDI drums was always like kind of natural for me and easy for me to like make it more real and all of that. So I started to offer those kind of services, and one thing led to another. I started to get some monthly demand, and like at the time I also started working with a producer from Rio de Janeiro, here. And he was the first one that trusted me with MIDI drums for him. And then I started focusing more on audio than drums. And like, it was a really natural transition, I think. Like, and nowadays I almost don't even play drums anymore. Like, I'm almost retired drummer, you could say. So yeah. And I can't say that I became more of an editor and an engineer like around last year, mid last year or something, when I worked with Lance Sprank, an Australian producer, and for the band Alpha Wolf. I edited drums for the whole record, and by the way, they just got nominated for the Grammy. So
That's amazing. I love Lance. He was on the podcast a long time ago, but yeah, he's a great dude. He's a lot of fun.
man, he's the best. He was kind enough to trust me with that, and I had an absolute blast working with him. At that point, I was treating like editing as a second gig, because suddenly I realized that I didn't want to produce. I really like to work by myself, doing my own thing here. Of course, that from time to time, I produce some projects that I'm into, that I really enjoy and want to be a part of. But outside of that, I like to do my own thing and work by myself. And I started to think like, if treating editing, I already have a cool demand and got to work with a project of this size, what will happen if I actually treated editing as my main gig and starting selling myself as an editor? And that's what happened. And from there, I started to really getting into it and really investing my time in getting better editing wise, and like vocal editing. That's something that's really, really important and really kind of hard to do, because there's so much detail that you have to take in consideration, and the music nowadays is very vocal focused, you can say. So it has to be perfect, it has to be extremely transparent, but at the same time perfect. So like, it's really hard to nail that. And so that was one thing that I really, really spent some time to get better on. And then in June this year, I was working a lot, and I also had a day job. So I was doing the two things at the same time, and it got to a point where I couldn't do both anymore. Like, I had to choose one or another, and of course, I chose to do audio.
Love that, man. That's awesome. It's interesting because I think you touched on this a little bit, but like, I feel like so many people get into this. Like, when you get into audio production, a lot of people, it's because they're working on their own music, and when they discover that they love music production, it's like the only options are like, I'm going to be a recording engineer, producer, or I'm going to become a mixing engineer. And I love that you kind of found that niche in the middle of being the editor, because it's something that I think a lot of people don't even like realize that the degree that editing can impact a recording. And I know that you and I, before we hit record, you were talking about that as well, and saying that like there's so much emphasis on like mixing, and I get that. It's like mixing is kind of like the sexy thing, right? Where you get to play with all these plugins and like all the gear, and it's attractive to people who like to play with technology, right? But editing can really make a massive impact in a recording and on a mix as well. And so I love you shifted your focus just towards being that person, because there's so many other producers and engineers and mixers, but the people that are amazing at editing, those are very few and far between. So it's cool that you kind of found that niche there. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about that, having worked with the fact that you work with a lot of different engineers, I'm assuming that you're probably working based on their expectations of editing, right? Because some people want things super tight. Some people want things a little looser and that kind of thing. So maybe like one of the first places we should start, because I definitely want to dig into your editing and session prep process. Maybe one of the first things we should ask is like, when it comes to editing, what is your expectation of an edit? Like, what do you think music should sound like when before it's been edited and after it's been edited?
So, of course, it's genre dependent, but I really like the more pop kind of stuff. So I really like a perfect but still natural vocal. I really like a really tight drums and bass. So the only thing that I like to be more loose with, it's like guitars, because I feel like they get wider if you don't like edit them like really hard. You can definitely make them narrower if you do that. But I really like tight stuff, like the almost perfect kind of thing, because I grew up listening to the Joey Sturgis era of metal. So like bands like Asking Alexandra, The Devil Wears Prada, and those kind of bands. And they were aiming for a perfect kind of sound, I think, at least, because drums were programmed, guitars were really tight edited, and vocals were super tuned, and like, so I grew up listening to those things. And even when I play drums, that was what I was aiming for. I really wanted to be like that drummer that like kind of, I don't know if you heard about this guy, but Alex Rudinger is a major inspiration for me. I mean, that guy is insanely tight. So that's what I like listening to and doing, of course. But yeah, I definitely have some producers that like things to be less tight. Like I work a ton with country and Christian music nowadays, even though I'm a metal guy, but I'm working with a ton of stuff nowadays. And they especially ask me to keep things a bit looser, because I have some producers that really like that kind of almost robotic, really tight editing, like where you can't almost differentiate the doubles from the main vocal, you know? But yeah, that's what I like, I'd say.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that I think it comes down to the genre of music for sure, because people have an expectation of what that genre sounds like, right? And when the bands that you listed in the metal world, it's like, yeah, those were bands that had super, super tight edits. So if you wanted it to sound as good as that quality, then it had to be the same. But it's funny because I feel like that the thing with editing that maybe is why it's so overlooked is that, like, I feel like a lot of musicians just have too big of an ego about themselves. Maybe that's not the right way, but it's like there's a lot of people who believe that, like, well, as long as I get really good recordings and they sound tight on the recording, then like I don't need to edit it any further. Or they'll be like, oh, I don't want it to sound robotic, you know? But it's also like, I kind of laugh when I hear people say that, because to me it's like, as a musician, I think our goal is to like want to be the tightest we can be. And of course we want to like get it as tight as we can. But if we can make it sound tighter and even more perfect on a record, like, isn't that what you intended it to sound like originally? You know, like that's kind of how I look at it, right? I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. Like for people who maybe think that, like, you know, music should be loose or should be more natural, or that they shouldn't have to edit if they already have good recordings. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that, like, you can do whatever you want, but if you want to reach for a market in music, if you want to like be on that industry standard, you can say, like, you definitely have to be super, super tight. And because like everyone does it, so you can't not do it and expect to have the same results, you know? Because like I was saying, the bands that I grew up listening were perfect. So, and we know that humans are not perfect. So if you want that perfect result, you have to edit. And I mean, I had in the past musicians that had that mindset, like, oh, we don't need editing. We just want you to mix our song. We track it we will track it very well, and you don't even have to edit. And it never happens. I always would end up editing, because, like, especially in metal, if you start layering samples under like a bunch of kicks and snares that are flaming with themselves, like, it will sound horrible, you know? So like, it has to be tight. It has to be done. So
of course, I agree with that. I've always said that, like, I think that like part of what makes the music sound tight and polished is the fact that things hit at the same time. Like, that adds way more impact as opposed to having everything kind of flamming and being like, you know, not quite locked in. And the other benefit to it, I think, too, is that, like, when you sync everything up like that, it actually creates more space between the notes. It creates more of a pocket. And I feel like when you edit things properly, that space allows room for like reverb tails or delays or effects or whatever to live and to be heard clearly. So your mix just naturally sounds cleaner because you have more space between the notes and you're not just hearing a wash of noise all the time. So editing can definitely help tighten things up and give you that polish to your mix before you even touch the faders, really. So yeah, that's one of my big reasons for editing as well. Now, I realize like maybe we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. Like there might still be people listening to this that don't even know really what the editing stage can entail. Maybe people have heard like, maybe people understand the idea of like, you punch in stuff and you comp takes and that kind of thing. But can you maybe give us a high level overview of what are some of the other other steps that go into editing instruments like drums, bass, guitar, vocals, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, of course. I think that the not as known steps, I guess, I do a lot of cleaning with RX, like taking out noises. And like maybe I get to choose sometimes the takes that maybe were not as great, because it's one thing when you are listening to the takes and all of them are good enough, I guess. But when you have a lot of experience with editing, you kind of can already tell if something can be edited or not. Like that's one thing too. Like you can't save a poorly track. Like you can't save a really bad drummer. It will still sound horrible. Like editing, I think editing sometimes is looked as a saving kind of tool, like where you can save a really bad play or something like that. And I think about it more as a polishing kind of process, like you just elevate what's already there. Because, like I said, if the recording is horrible, then the edits will sound like mediocre or like decent at the max, So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just never reaches its full potential.
No, like, I mean, you will have a bunch of artifacts and like you will start to create another set of problems, So
yeah,
I think I think that sometimes editing can be misinterpreted. I think.
Yeah. So then as far as, maybe let's dive into some instruments, like as far as editing drums goes, what kind of things would you be typically doing when you're editing a drum track?
I usually listen to the song first, and that's how I decide if I want things to be tighter or looser, because like if it's a country song with I don't know, like a triplet kind of feel and that kind of stuff, you don't want to edit that thing. And because I'm Brazilian, we have a bunch of rhythms and genres here that if you edit that kind of stuff, you will kill the music, but basically. So having that kind of experience definitely helps with like the more loose kind of stuff that I get to edit sometimes. And of course, when it's metal, it's 100% tight. That's usually what people like. And so I listen to the song first to decide which way I want to go. And if I want to do things 100% tight and on the grid, I just use Beat Detective and for like the kick and snare and toms, the shells. And I like to have the cymbals a bit looser, like, because then, I don't know, we can keep things more natural sometimes. But if it sounds bad, like if when referencing to the song, it get distracting, then I will fix it. But like I will grid it 100% most of the times, and always look for flams, kicks and snares that are not hitting at the same time. You definitely have to take care of those things. Toms, fills. I know people that like to keep fills a bit looser, but I like to grid everything because I know that there are some things that you can definitely take the feeling out of them if you edit too much. But I also think that the feel and the intention of the performance is on the playing. And if I put things on the grid, I'm not necessarily taking that out. I'm just enhancing it, Obviously, that will vary too, depending on the kind of music that I'm working on. But yeah, so 100% on the grid. Cymbals, I will give the song a listen if anything feels distracting or whatnot. And if it does, then I will fix them. And if not, then I won't touch it.
For sure. I'm with you on that. Like, I think when I think of drum editing, I always approach it from the perspective of like the shells are the things that people are dancing to. It's like the kick and snare. Those are the main rhythms, and the toms are providing some feel as well. But the cymbals, most of the time, that's just kind of like it's a texture to the drums. Obviously, if it's like a hi-hat count in the middle of a song or something like that, and that doesn't feel like it's locked in, then it's going to get distracting, right? So you have to tighten those kind of sections up. But generally, I agree with you that like, shells are the way to go with that. You did mention the idea of like sometimes you'll have flams where you might have like, maybe it's like a 4 on the floor kind of beat where the kick and snare are playing at the same time, and maybe the snare is like a little behind the kick or the other way around. When it comes to those kind of situations, how do you decide what you're going to move or prioritize or when to leave it as a flam?
So when it's kick and snare, it's rarely intentional. It's always almost, I won't say a mistake, but common to do those kind of flams. Because like we were talking, humans are imperfect, so it's very rare that someone gets to like can play the kick and snare at the same time every time. It's very, very rare. I think that even Alex Rudinger can do that. So those kind of things I will fix, and I always move the kick, because I want the rest of the kit I want to keep the phase relationship between everything. And the kick, you can always like cut the low end for the rooms if it sounds bad. And we are usually cutting a bunch of low end from overheads and that kind of stuff, and especially if it sounds bad. So I always try to move the kick only.
So just to clarify, your snare will be the thing that's on the beat, and then you're moving the kick that's maybe off time. You'll move that to lock in with the snare. Yeah. Gotcha.
I think that the snare is the priority always, like, because that's the loudest thing in all of the mics. So I try to move only the kick in those cases. And I think that since I'm a drummer, I know when it's intentional or not. You definitely have to have that knowledge to be able to decide what to fix or not. And intentional flams are something that's weird to work on too, because like I think that the right thing to do, at least in theory, is to put the accent on the grid and have the first note of the flam behind the grid. But that doesn't sound good to me. I always like to put the first note on the grid. That sounds the most natural to me.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that like as far as fixing those flams, I'm almost always like locking in my snare on the beat as well, for the same reasons that you said. Like often we get rid of all that low end, or maybe we had kick samples and that kind of stuff, whereas the snare is so loud that it just makes its way into everything. So it's kind of like you'll hear, if you added a sample or something like that, you're going to hear that original snare in there in like the room sound, and it could sound weird, but the kick often is kind of missing from those tracks. So I really appreciate that you brought that up there. It's a good attention to detail, which I agree with. Obviously, like timing is it's the most obvious thing when it comes to editing drums. But I know that I've worked with other editors in the past, and I believe you do this as well, where they'll take editing a step further and they'll even start preparing, like they'll convert the drums to MIDI, or they'll create like audio trigger tracks or that kind of thing. Is that something that you do? And if so, like, why would people want MIDI versions of their tracks, or why would they want trigger tracks?
So my process usually, and now we're talking about more mix prepping, maybe. People usually ask me, and I do that myself as well for my own mixes. Cleaning the toms, like strip silencing them so you don't have unnecessary bleed, and doing that as well for spot mics like hi-hat and splashes, ride or whatnot. And then doing that for toms, I have a cool process of using that plugin silencer from, is it Black Salt Audio, the company? I don't remember. It's doing that kind of thing, that kind of trick, using a high cut to clean the cymbal ringing of on the toms. So I do that as well to clean the toms and have them really clean. And then I turn the shells into MIDI. I use Messy DRT, which is, unfortunately, it's Pro Tools and Mac only, but it's the best tool for that kind of thing. It's almost always the most reliable one because it gets you the closest result that I found so far. And you have to align all of those MIDI notes to the shells to keep the phase. And people usually like having MIDI to print them to audio and use that audio to trigger the trigger tracks with Slate Trigger, or have the MIDI to use with like drum libraries that they like, and also to trigger gates. People really like to, especially in metal. I'm not seeing a ton of that in other genres. Like for country, I've never done that, aside from cleaning up the toms and spot mics sometimes. But even that, I don't get asked that a lot for other genres. But for metal, I think that you can use the MIDI to trigger gates with sidechain. So you make sure that the gate is only opening when the MIDI is hitting. And if you did that right, you're already checked that the MIDI is correct and you don't have any mistriggers and any extra MIDI notes. So that's why people like it. And also why people like to hire someone else to do it, because it's kind of time consuming. So that's usually why people do MIDI for drums, but I'm not seeing that a whole lot in other genres than in metal.
For sure. Yeah, it's funny. Like, I've always known that was a thing and that people used MIDI for gates and stuff like that. And I never gave it the time of day, because for the same reason that you said, like, you know, I would already edit my drums and that was time consuming. And then the idea of like turning things to MIDI, I was like, you know, I don't think I'm going to use this. And then a while back, I hired my first drum editor and he gave me MIDI and I was like, okay, now I'm actually going to put this to the test. And like, I find it so hard to go back now, because it's like, it's so helpful to have that kind of stuff in there. And, you know, like those are just little details that, you know, sometimes we don't think about it because, you know, we focus only on the things that are going to make it into the mix, and we're not focusing on tools that are going to allow us to mix easier. So maybe you have to add some extra steps, but it ends up making your life a lot easier and you fight your mix less, and, you know, you have more control of your tracks. So, you know, I think it's cool for people to hear about this kind of stuff, because it is that thing that like most people don't even realize, that like there are these little tricks that engineers are using to mix easier. And it just requires some extra steps in the editing stage to set yourself up for that. So yeah, I love that you bring that up. When it comes to like guitar and bass, like what tips do you have there as far as making sure that those are tight?
Okay, so for bass, it's different than for guitars. And for bass, I like the bass to be like 100% locked in with the kick, especially because I think that the bass is the source of your low end in the mix, and if that isn't as tight as it should, maybe it can create a few problems in the mixing stage. So I like that to be 100% locked in with the kick. And the guitars, I like them to be a bit looser. Of course, always, if it sounds bad, I will work on it. But for guitars, I usually just like, I will edit one side of them and then reference that first side to edit the other one. I will listen to the guitars and only move stuff that I think sounds bad, and that can like allow me to decide if I want to edit note per note, which is something common but that I don't really like doing. But like if it sounds bad, I can do that, but then I'm doing it for a purpose because it sounds bad. So, but I will only move things that are sounding bad and then are distracting to me. But for bass, 100% locked in.
And are you using like elastic audio for that, or are you using like slip editing and cutting up regions and moving those around?
Almost exclusively slip editing, because I think that elastic audio, even though like I use Pro Tools as my main DAW, and even though Pro Tools is getting really good with those algorithms, they're still not perfect, and you can definitely hear the artifacts that it leaves. On guitars, I think that they're a bit more forgiving because like you will hit the DIs with a ton of distortion after the fact. So it's kind of a bit more forgiving. So sometimes I will use elastic audio. And when I do, I like to use the X-Form algorithm. I think that sounds the best, at least so far. But I try not to use it if I can get away with it. I almost always prefer to copy and paste stuff that it's better than using that. But sometimes you only have one take of that, or that part doesn't repeat, so you have to reach out for tools that like that, and then I will use it. But other than that, slip editing 100%, especially for bass, because when you use elastic audio, you're also changing the duration of the waveforms, like the periods, and that can sound really bad on bass, especially because the notes are so low and the duration of them is really long, and like not the duration, but the period, it's not as fast as a higher note, so you can really mess up a bass tone with that.
Yeah, like the wavelength of a bass note is definitely longer than something that's like a guitar or something that's a little higher pitch. Yeah. That's cool. As far as, we talked about like using MIDI to help with mixing. Is there anything that people should be considering when they're maybe recording guitars or bass that makes the editing process easier? Because, I think of immediately like if you're recording through a live guitar amp, the waveform's just going to look like a giant sausage because you can't see any note definition. You don't see where the picks were. Do you have any tips there for helping people get better edits with their guitars and bass?
Definitely always track with DIs. Even if you're recording a live amp, like you said, always record DI, because it's much easier to see the notes, and especially the peak attack on the DI tracks. And what we usually do is just group those tracks, the DI and the amp. And whenever you're editing the DI, you're also editing the amp track. So that's the only thing I'd say. And of course, making sure that it's in tune, and that is not exclusive to editing now. It's like an overall thing for all of the stages. Making sure that it's always in tune, that the strings are new, that the peak attack is really the best that it can be, that the takes are correct. Like often, unless it's in purpose, but I'll often get some takes that like the guitar player did one thing on the left side and you're hitting the right side and it's a bit different, and you definitely have to redo those kind of things, unless it's, like I said, in purpose, like you're doing maybe a harmony or something like that. But yeah, just like making sure that you're tracking it properly with everything in check. And for editing, I would say that the DI track is the most useful thing for bass and guitars.
Yeah, I love that. And I also really appreciate that you brought up that idea of making sure your left and right sides are the same strumming patterns. That's almost always one of the big things that I end up working on with bands whenever I'm doing pre-production is like, I'll say like, hey, guitar player over here, like, what do you play in the verse? And what do you play in the verse? And I just watch their hands. And most of the time someone's like rushing a note or pushing it or something like that. And so, or even like, you get the person that's playing all downstrokes versus down up, like all that stuff can make a big impact in the quality of the recording that you get. So yeah, paying attention to those little details in the tracking stage are certainly going to make editing a lot easier and make everything feel a lot tighter as well. So yeah, I like that you mentioned that. We've talked about drums, we've talked about guitar, bass. Let's maybe move on to vocals. Like when it comes to editing vocals, I know a lot of the big tools, like the most common tools people would use for those would be like Autotune or Melodyne, that kind of thing. Like, do you have a preference when it comes to tools to use for vocal editing?
Yes, and it's kind of weird, but I see a lot of people doing that too. Like, because I really like Melodyne for the workflow, but I love Autotune for the sound because I think that Autotune sounds the best. It's the most used one, so of course it will be the industry, the commercial kind of sound. So what I'll do is I'll tune in Melodyne, the fine tune of things, and I'll have Melodyne into Autotune. And nowadays Melodyne is native on Pro Tools, so I like to have Melodyne activated and then Autotune as an insert on the track, and then print those together.
Gotcha. So you're using Melodyne as like the note correction tool, and then Autotune is more of like the sound of the Autotune, that kind of thing, like smoothing out the notes and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I'll have Autotune in auto mode, but really like lightly with a slow retune speed because I don't want that T-Pain sound, And like I like to keep the humanize knob at 100% to make the transitions and the ramps, you can say the transitions between the notes the most natural as possible. And yeah, that's what I like.
That's cool. I like that. Yeah, I've always used, to me, like I've always found Autotune to be so unpredictable sometimes. So like I'm the same way, like where like Melodyne is like always my go-to tool for any sort of note correction because I have control of that there. It's slower for sure, but it definitely gives you a lot more control. But I agree that like sometimes you want that kind of tuned sound, and maybe Autotune is the way to go there. I know also in Melodyne, there's like I think it's the pitch modulation tool that kind of does the same thing as Autotune would do. It's a lot more manual work, but yeah, I mean, both of those options can work really well as far as getting that kind of smoother sound.
Using that kind of workflow with Autotune in auto mode, it also makes Melodyne a bit faster because you don't have to go in with as much detail as if you didn't have Autotune, because maybe I think that Melodyne can be very natural, and so you have to do more work to have that really tuned pop sound. And having Autotune after Melodyne, I think that it's way easier and faster as well. So that's why I like that kind of workflow as well.
For sure. I've even like taken it up another step where I sometimes will put Autotune before Melodyne and just like make it like very, very light with the tuning correction, because then that makes Melodyne even easier as well, because it's already kind of ballparked the notes a little bit. But as long as you've got like it sounding human like, then that kind of makes that process of the manual note moving a lot easier as well. So yeah, there's lots of different ways to do it.
Yeah, that way can be really useful if you're tracking the artist, because then you're making sure that Autotune is acting correctly based on you're choosing the settings based on the singer, and then you're making sure already that it sounds good. Because sometimes, like, since I'm just editing, if you put Autotune first, it can sound weird in some spots and then give you maybe more work in Melodyne,
Yeah, fair.
So that's why I like to have Melodyne first, because then I'm doing all the manual work and the fine tuning of things, and then having Autotune just for the sound and that extra 10% of polishing,
For sure, yeah. You have to be very, very careful with having with having Autotune as the first thing in your chain because it is a little bit more unpredictable. If you do have like the settings a lot more, just gently hitting it with way more of that humanization and like the what is it, the flex tool or whatever they call it there. It's not flex tool, whatever that option is. I can't remember. But yeah, there's options in there that you can do to make it sound more human, and so it's not like attacking the notes and making that T-Pain Cher kind of sound. Now, as far as when you're editing vocals, what do you tend to focus on first? Do you focus on timing first or pitch first whenever you're making those corrections?
I like to do timing first, even though I've heard that tuning messes a bit with timing, and I've heard that maybe it doesn't make sense to do timing first. But in my opinion, I like to do timing first because tuning is the most destructive process, I guess. Especially if the vocalist is not as great. So I like doing timing first, and then I do tuning. Then I make sure everything sounding good, and then I'll do cleaning last, like cleaning breaths from doubles and harmonies, doing some RX magic if needed, like taking out mouth clicks and maybe some denoising on some spots and that kind of thing. Deplosive as well. Like, man, RX is so good. I love it so much. I love it so much. It's a lifesaver.
It's such a powerful tool, and yeah, it's like I remember putting that plugin off for a long time because it's an expensive plugin, but as soon as I got it and I realized the power of it, it just changes everything. Like if you are trying to get rid of a lot of noises and like little details, and then there's nothing that beats it. It gives you so much control over editing your tracks. So yeah, I think anyone who's working with a lot of music coming from different artists or different producers, engineers, whatever, it's like that's a tool that you need in your toolbox just to really have all the editing capabilities with it.
You gotta have at least the Elements version. At least, like, you gotta have it. It's a must, definitely.
For sure. As far as things like harmonies or doubled vocals, that kind of stuff, are you ever using tools like Vocaline or Revoice or anything like that?
Yeah, I like using Vocaline, not for our screams, though. I find that for more raspy vocals, distorted vocals, it does some weird stuff, like some weird artifacts. I don't know why, but for those kind of tracks, I stopped using it. But for more common songs, I like Vocaline, but I try to use just for the bulk of the, like, for 80% maybe, and then I'll fine tune what Vocaline did by hand. But I don't know. I think I may be falling out of love from it because sometimes it causes more problems than it solves, So I don't know. I'm still in the fence. Like, I really like it, and when it works, it works great, saves a ton of time. But yeah, sometimes I'm not even using it because I know it will cause some problems. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I've always found that it's a major time saver, and that's one of the reasons why, like, as far as plugins go, it's always one of the plugins that I recommend people actually get because it will save you a ton of time for when you need it. But you do have to be very selective of how you use it. If you try to do it across a whole song, it's going to glitch. If you do it in small chunks, it's going to work great. And you just also have to make sure that, when you're tracking things, that you're paying attention to, how long is the breath before the note or that kind of thing, because those kind of little details can sometimes throw it off. So as long as the more you use it, the more you start to learn when it's going to glitch, and then you can adjust your recording process to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success with it. So yeah, it is a very powerful plugin. So I love that. But yeah, I guess one of the things I think we kind of hinted to this earlier is that, like, one of the reasons why I feel like so many people kind of ignore editing is because it does seem like a very time-consuming process. And everything we just talked about here, there's a lot of different steps that go into it. Do you have any tricks for speeding up that process? Are you using any sort of macros or anything like that that's helping you through that process?
These days, I'm using SoundFlow along with a Stream Deck for macros and scripts because that saves a lot of time. Like, before updating Pro Tools, because I don't use the subscription. I have a perpetual version. So until like maybe March or April of this year, I was still using the 2021 version of Pro Tools, and I didn't have Melodyne as a native thing in Pro Tools. So I would have that Andro Shaps macro to insert Melodyne, record the track, then print the track with Melodyne, delete that, and then have the Melodyne info there without having to actually listen to the whole thing, you know? So that was a great thing. But since then, of course, I'm not using it anymore, but I'm doing things like I have a bunch of audio suite plugins in my Stream Deck, a bunch of like shortcuts to delete fades, because in Pro Tools some stuff are harder to not harder, but more time consuming than in other DAWs. And so like I have a shortcut to delete a track instead of having to go like and left click and go to the delete option. You can do some stuff natively nowadays. Now you have the option of creating new shortcuts and new stuff inside Pro Tools without you having to use a third-party software or something. But at the time, I didn't have it, so I just kept it. I think that in Pro Tools, I really like Beat Detective, but as with Vocaline, it also does some weird things from time to time. Vocaline, as we were talking, is a huge time saver. Doing the Melodyne with Autotune thing is also a great time saver, but for the most part, I think that you get faster the more you do it, you know? Like it's because then you will find some stuff that you do a lot of times, and then I have a macro for some stuff that I'm always doing. And you know how it is. If you can save, like, even if it takes 2 seconds to do, 3 seconds to do, like if you're doing that like 300 times a day or even more, it can add up and like be relevant. So I always try to like one tip that I got recently that I really liked is do work on the song the way you do always, and write down everything that you do a bunch of times throughout the song, throughout the process, and then turn those things into macros or scripts and start using those.
Yep, I totally agree with that. That's definitely one of the things I talk about with my coaching students all the time is like, you know, what can you automate? Like, what are those things that are taking up your time that you don't even think about, but you know you need to do, and they just kind of take away from your mental focus and all that kind of stuff. So anything like that, you definitely want to be automating as much as possible. I think, you know, having a Stream Deck is huge for that, or SoundFlow is huge for that.
Man, it's amazing. Unfortunately, it's Mac only, but like things like I said, as simple as deleting a track in Pro Tools, you have to left click on the track and then choose the option to delete. And if I have a shortcut to do that, it will save me seconds. But like we said, if you do that a bunch of times throughout the day, throughout the week, it can really add up. And things like deleting fades, it can be a pain in the ass if you always have to click right on the crossfade to delete it. Now I can just select the region and press delete, you know, those kind of things. And one thing that I see and that I got as well working with other editors, because like I said, I'm a mixing engineer myself too, so I have my own assistant to edit and mix prep stuff for me nowadays. And one thing that I see a bunch of amateur producers, amateur editors as well, is having different notes in vocal doubles that are supposed to be exactly like the main, because you're using them to have that wide vocal, you know, and like, so maybe the take isn't great. I don't know, the singer did something different. and you will edit the track based on what the singer did. But sometimes you have to like bend a bit, to make that match, because otherwise it just doesn't make sense to have those tracks. So one thing that I see a lot is the doubles not matching with the main. So what I would do to save a bit more time, instead of going through one track one by one, I will do the main one and then bend the main or any of them to both sides. So I will have the main in the right side and the double that I'm working on in the left side, and I'll listen to them together and edit the double based on what I'm hearing on the right side. That is the main. That I'm finding that is saving me a lot of time, because what I was doing is doing each one separately and then listening to those together and fixing whatever was different. But now that saved me a lot of time. And I do those for guitars as well, like listening to one side and fixing the other side based on the left side. So that's been a major time saver as well, just to make sure that you get everything correct from the get-go, and you don't have to keep coming back and fixing things after the fact.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I remember like even when I was first getting started with it, like with Melodyne, I had the full version of Melodyne, and with that you can see any instance of Melodyne so in one window, which is great because like, let's say you've tuned up your lead vocal, you can easily see the notes that you snapped everything to, and you can, adjust everything to match that. But I've also found too that like a great time saver going back to VocalLine is like with their newest, I believe it's like they call it the pro version now. It's whatever the top tier is. Like that allows you to snap timing and pitch. So just another thing that I found really saved a lot of time is like I would Melodyne and tune my lead vocal, and then I wouldn't even bother with Melodyne for the double. I would just use VocalLine because I already had a guide of what I wanted it to sound like, and then you can use VocalLine to just snap timing and pitch in one button press, which is great. So like, yeah, again, like those tools, they're there to make your life easier, not just like correct things, but like make things work faster. And as long as you can figure out your workflow and what that looks like, it's going to save you that time and make this process more enjoyable. On average, like how long would you say it takes you to edit like a full song if you had like drums, bass, guitar, vocals? Obviously, it's going to depend on like the number of tracks that you have, but
nowadays I guess I can do like a song a day, maybe edit a full song in an afternoon, a couple of hours. But if it definitely depends on the kind of music that I'm working on, the amount of tracks, because if it's metal, it will take a lot more time to get it done. If it's country, it's way simpler. It's way simpler, so it will take way less time. So it depends, but usually a day for a whole song. And one thing that I'll say about the tools that we're talking about is I like using them to get me in the ballpark, so I don't have to do it from scratch. But at the same time, I won't rely on it to get it where I want it, So like I will use like VocalLine for maybe 80% or 70% of the work, and then go from there. Like I think of it almost like AI, maybe, like, because I see a bunch of people like afraid of AI stealing their work and that kind of stuff. And like I try to think that AI is there to help us, at least for the most part, I guess. And like use that tool in your favor to save time for you, but don't trust on it, Don't trust on it to get the results. Like use them to save your time and get like almost there, like halfway there. But definitely take the time to make sure that everything is sounding great. Because one thing that's really common as well, going back to the amateur editors that I see a lot, is like leaving artifacts, especially from tuning, from Autotune. Autotune is something that gives me the most, maybe it's it's sometimes it's a pain in the ass because it causes some artifacts that like I can't understand, like some random stuff, but it sounds great, so I'll deal with that. But like, make sure that it's sounding great, that you don't have any clicks or pops coming from Autotune. Make sure that all the tracks that you're sending out to the producer are sounding great, are as clean as they can be. That's something that, like we were talking about, you have to really care about the details on that kind of work. Editing, mix prepping, it's all about the details. I say to my assistant that you can really separate a professional from an amateur based on the details, because like everyone can beat detective drums, everyone can Melodyne a vocal track, but making it sound really good and really clean, and like making it seem like you don't even touch that, you just made it better. I think that's where the professional shines.
Of course, yeah, that human element is definitely important. And I would even add, just to like some of the things that you were saying that you notice in amateur edits, fades. That's like one of the biggest things that I notice all the time. And it drives me nuts whenever I'm like mixing or mastering stuff and I just hear like clicks and pops all over the place. And, it's just like the fade is the reason for that. So if you're making edits, people, make sure you've got your fades in there. That will prevent those clicks and pops. And sometimes like those things are just so small that people don't even hear them. But like, you just have to know, like by default, make fades on every cut you make, and it's going to help save everything. Some DAWs are great, and some DAWs automatically do that for you. I know Pro Tools doesn't, and it pisses me off. But hey, it makes you pay attention to the details more, right? So I think I 100% agree with you that it's all about the details that make something sound really good. You talked about mix prep, and I know that that's something else that you do a lot of in addition to the editing work you do. What are some of the essential mix prep tasks that you would typically end up doing for someone?
So it's usually cleaning up tracks, making sure that the edits are all good, and basically doing the routing, color coding, organizing the files in the mixers or the producer's template. So like doing all of the things that they don't want to lose time making. So making sure everything is routed correctly, that it's grouped together and correctly. Nowadays, one thing that I've been doing a ton is setting up the routing for making stems after the fact. So there's a mixer that I work with, Pedro Calloni. He's a Brazilian mixer that lives in LA. He'll have me set up his VCAs so he can print the tracks after the mix using Bounce Factory, which is an awesome tool as well. So that is something that I've been getting way more recently, is setting up the sessions to get it ready for stems after the mix is done. I've been asked to even print stems for the mixer, like, because they don't want to lose time doing that anymore, like, especially because even if you're using a tool like Bounce Factory, you still have to make time for the tool to work. So you still have to not be able to use your machine while it's doing that, So people nowadays, because I don't see that as much in Nashville, but LA is kind of crazy all over the place. Everything's so fast. So our role is to make their life easier and save them time. So if they're losing time with stems, that's where you should help them, So those are the things that I've been doing lately.
I love that. Yeah, I think I love what you just said there about like your goal with mix prep is just to really save time and make life easier. And so it's like, I think so many people just focus on what's happening in the moment and they're not thinking ahead. Whereas like when you just take the time before you start a mix to like map out where is your routing going to be, like how's that going to be set up, and what does that allow you to do at the end of the session, like all those details go a really long way as far as just like keeping things flowing really fast and keeping your creativity there. So yeah, I think that's a really good point that you bring up there. I'm assuming a lot of your mix prep has to do with like, every engineer is going to have their own process, their own templates, that kind of thing. And you've probably had the opportunity to see a lot of different templates. Would you say that there's like any common threads that you see between a lot of different templates that people use as far as like how they're setting up their sessions for success?
I've noticed that pop sessions are way simpler, way easier to set up. Like for metal mixers, I'm doing a ton of cleaning up drums, like doing that process of cleaning toms, cleaning spot mics, and doing MIDI when the editor doesn't do it. That's usually my task. Making sure like a bunch of producers nowadays use sidechain as well for some stuff. So I have to make sure that the sidechain is working properly. And I think that most of the mixers that I work with, like really the thing that they don't want to do is have to organize all the files and into their template, and they just want to mix. So all of the time consuming stuff that they have to spend their brain energy doing, that's what I have to do. So just setting up things, just doing that kind of stuff that they don't want to lose time doing.
Are you ever like in the mix prep stage, are you ever dealing with things like levels, or are you just leaving that all up to the engineer?
Not, because like in the ideal world, and I see that a lot in pop, is the song works with all the faders at 0, which is crazy to me because like in metal, it's all over the place. You have to gain stage everything. You have to basically recreate the reference mix when you have it, and in pop, it's way more organized, and the song already works with everything at 0 because the producers will print their session basically throughout their processing, their levels. So it's just a matter of importing that to your workflow, adapting that to your workflow, and making sure that it sounds good from the get-go. So I've worked recently with a producer named Fulk, a really great producer. And for him, I do that. I will do a basic rough mix for him. So even EQ some stuff that it's kind of annoying or maybe distracting, so giving him a starting point. But yeah, it's not that common, but if I'm asked to do it, I'll do it.
Of course, yeah. So it sounds like a lot of the pop people are like printing their tracks with like the clip gain already in them and everything, which I think that's a really cool way of working, because then your faders are at 0, and that's kind of like the mystical thing. Like everyone hopes that they can have a mix that just works with the faders at 0, but I guess if we're working off clip gain, then that works. I know that even like Tom Lord Algae, I think he works a similar way where he likes to have all of his faders at 0, but in his like SSL channel strip plugin, that's where he does all of his gain staging, so that his faders on his desk are all at 0, which whatever workflow works for you ultimately is the important thing, right? One last question as far as like prepping. Working with a lot of different engineers, there's so many different templates that they're using, so many different ways that everyone works. Like, how do you organize all of these thoughts and make sure that you never miss any of these little steps? Like, do you ever are you making like checklists for yourself, or like how do you organize that process to make sure that you're not missing anything?
Yeah. So one thing that is kind of cool is that I have to have most of the DAWs. So I have Pro Tools, I have Logic, I have Reaper, I have Cubase. I don't have Ableton and Studio One, but aside from those, I have almost everything. And so I have a bunch of notes for each person, and I do have a checklist, because then when I finish prepping a session, I will like grab that checklist and see if I didn't miss anything. So yeah, I'll usually like do a call with the producer. They will explain their workflow to me, and I will take notes based on that. But most templates are kind of self-explanatory sometimes. So as you get more experience, you will get easier to understand someone else's template. But yeah, I definitely have checklists. I have a bunch of notes written down here because you don't want to miss anything. Like, it's okay to make a mistake once or twice, but if it becomes a common thing, then it starts to get dangerous.
For sure, of course. Man, this has been, I've really enjoyed learning about this. It's stuff that I think we don't talk enough about on the podcast, but it has so much importance in the quality of the work that people make. And so to have you go through the whole process today and outline what you're doing with editing your drums, bass, guitar, vocals, and then how you're prepping mixes, I think that those are things that people definitely need to take into consideration. And whether they're working with an assistant or having an editor do all that work for them or not, whether they're doing it all themselves, these are still things that need to be done. And it's important for them to know what goes into all of that. So yeah, dude, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here and help us out today with that. If people want to learn more about you, like, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can reach out to me on my Instagram and on my Facebook. My Instagram is bassani.samuel. And I'm always online there, so they can just DM me or look for Samuel Bassani on Facebook and DM me there as well.
Awesome. Dude, Again, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Dude, thanks for having me. I'm absolutely honored to be here. And yeah, thanks for having me.
So that was my episode with Samuel Bassani, and I really enjoyed that conversation. I loved learning more about his process and a lot of the little steps that he takes along the way to make sure that his raw recordings end up sounding way more polished, and how he uses those edits to make the mixing process easier as well. And I thought it was really cool to learn about some of the little tricks that he does or that he suggests people do in the recording stage to make editing and mixing easier. And things like, recording with the DI, which I think a lot of people don't even think about. I mean, some people record just with the DI, and that's fine. But if you're recording amps, a lot of people don't think to record the DI, but the DI is going to make editing easier because you can actually see the waveform as opposed to a sausage, right? Something like that goes a long way. Or even when he was talking about using MIDI or trigger audio clips to help with gating in the mixing stage. Those are things that aren't obvious to us when we're listening to tracks, but when you take the time to build them into your sessions, it streamlines the process and it allows you to get better results faster, which is really the whole point of this, right? None of us want to spend the time editing tracks. None of us want to spend tons of time mixing, but we want to be able to get the pro results. Sometimes that means that we have to just do some extra things to make the process smoother. And so I like that Samuel went into the details about some of those tricks to make that process a little bit more optimized and to help you get better results out of it. I also thought it was fun to talk about the order of how he does things too, and how, for example, with vocals, he'll use Melodyne and Autotune together. Sometimes these different plugins allow us to get results faster as well, and they allow us to get more polish, and it requires less manual effort when we can combine different tools. It's just a matter of figuring out what that workflow looks like and what order you're going to do things in so that you can actually streamline that process. So, I think that if there's anything to take from this episode, number one, it's that you have to be editing your tracks. You have to definitely be putting the time aside to edit your tracks and not let your ego get in the way or not focus on how long it's going to take. Just do it. You're going to get better results out of it. So that's number one. But number two is figuring out what your workflow looks like and getting clear on all of the little steps that go into that editing process for you and utilizing the tools that you already have at your disposal. Once you get very clear on what that looks like, you're going to start to hear significant improvements in your recordings. So definitely go back to this episode, listen over again, and pay attention to a lot of those little steps that he talked about and the order in which he does things, because I totally agree with the way Samuel does things. That's exactly how I edit my tracks as well. So I know that system works. If you're looking to get pro results, you have to be implementing this. And if you absolutely hate the process of editing, much like myself, then hire someone like Samuel who does this. It's going to save you so much time. And yes, it's going to cost you a little bit of money, but there's actually an advantage to hiring people like Samuel to do this kind of stuff because it saves you time. which then allows you to use that time to maybe work on other projects where you can make more money. Or the other benefit to it, and one of the reasons why I've started to hire editors for my tracks, is that I don't have to listen to the same song a million times. And sometimes when you're working on music, you hear the same song a million times between the recording stage, editing stage, and then mixing stage. And when that happens, you start to lose your perspective. So being able to outsource some of this work to someone like Samuel is very, very helpful because it eliminates the repetition that you hear, and it allows you to have a fresher perspective on the tracks whenever you get into mixing so that you can be focused and be creative and not just be burnt out by the song, right? So yeah, I think there are so many different angles to go with when it comes to editing, but the bottom line is that editing is a major part of the production process, and you have to be implementing it into your own tracks, whether it's you doing it or hiring someone else. So yeah, I really enjoyed that episode, and I hope that you took a lot of great takeaways from it. If you did, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And if you're listening to this episode and you're thinking to yourself like, okay, great, I know I need to edit, but maybe I don't want to hire an editor. Maybe I don't have the money for it. I want to learn how to do it on my own. But you're not sure what to be doing. You're not sure how to edit your drums for timing or edit your vocals for pitch correction or any of that stuff that we talked about in this episode. If you're looking for one-on-one help to guide you throughout that entire process, as well as help you with the things you should be taking care of in the recording stage to set yourself up for success, and then knowing what to do with your mixing tools, basically just everything from beginning to end when it comes to production. If you're looking for one-on-one help with that and you want someone that can give you that process, then give you feedback and accountability and guidance throughout the entire process, that is exactly what I help with inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And if you're interested in learning more about that and getting that one-on-one accountability, that one-on-one feedback, one-on-one coaching, then make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And on that page, you'll find a link where you can book a call with me because I want to only work with people who I truly believe I can help. So I'd love to hop on a call with you to learn more about what you're working on, what your goals are, what's working for you, what's not working for you, to see if I can truly help you. And if it does seem like I can help, then we'll definitely talk about what it would look like to work inside the program. And if you're not a good fit or it doesn't seem like I can help you, I'll let you know. So once again, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details of the program there and book your call with me. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. Talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.